Hello, my name's Rob Edwards. Welcome back to my YouTube channel, and today we are once more talking Wheel of Time. This time it's Season 1, Episode 6, The Flame of Tar Velon. Join me and my Finnish Christmas elf as we go through this episode, scene by scene, using 7 stills from the episode as my guide. We are going to start completely book spoiler free, but I am going to then, having reached the end of those 7 images, come back again and talk some book spoilers, because there's a lot of stuff which happens here which I really want to talk about. But certainly for the first section, you are spoiler free, you are good to watch if all you want to know is what my take on this episode was. Let's get to it. So the episode starts with a flashback. We see a young Swan Sanche, who we will later meet as the Amelin Seat, growing up as a fisherman's daughter outside the city of Tyr. This reflects pretty much the background we have for her in the books. I think perhaps in the books a little bit more based in the city rather than sort of out in the wilds here. But we do see, I think, in the background what looks to be the city, or at least the stone of Tyr, in one of the shots in this flashback. One of the things in the books, and this isn't a spoiler, this is just some world-building stuff, different people around the world have different relationships with the people who can channel. And Tyr is not a fan. Tyr, as a city, as a state, basically does not approve of anyone who can channel, be they male or female. And so the fact that Swan is born with this ability, and that she has begun using it to help her father, has clearly gotten the family into trouble. I don't think she's spotted in this use of the wand power, but the fact that she is so capable with it by now clearly so shows that she's been using the power before this time. So it must be that she was spotted previously, and that is why someone has painted the dragon's fang symbol on her door and then burnt down the rest of the house. It's a pretty heartbreaking scene because it does mean that she is going to have to leave. It is not safe for her around Tyr anymore. So her father puts her in the family boat and sends her north on what's going to be an extremely long journey to Tar Velon. I like this scene. It's a good, solid scene. It gives us some background on a very important character to this episode and the series as a whole, without having to stand there and do a whole lot of exposition. We get to, it is show don't tell. We get to see how Swan's upbringing has affected her in later life. Because we meet her pretty much immediately as a grown-up, as the Amelin Seat, as the ruler, essentially, of the White Tower. And the first scene we meet her in is the trial of Legane, the trial of the 3 sisters that the Amelin is holding responsible for gentling Legane without a trial and potentially getting one of their sisters killed. Really interesting scene, this one. We see that Legane is distraught, having lost his ability to contact the wand power, and he tries to bait the Amelin into executing him, but she sees through that and doesn't give him that release. It is actually quite interesting, I think, that we have quite an aggressive stance here from the Amelin towards Legane. I can only assume that is partly because one of the sisters, Herein, was killed by Legane, and also, I guess, partly because of the chaos that he caused in Gildan. Generally speaking, the Aes Sedai are typically more forgiving of a man who can channel. Once they've safely gentled him, they will not punish him further because the act of gentling is seen as punishment enough. Important and essential and for the good of the world, but still punishment nonetheless. We then have this rather confused point where Leandrin tries to get a dig in on Maureen about concealing Nynaeve. I'm not sure that necessarily lands terribly well as an accusation. So many of the Aes Sedai who were on the journey with Legane were healed by Nynaeve. They must have seen the level of power she was putting out, they must know quite how strong Nynaeve is. So quite how Maureen can be accused of keeping it a secret or keeping Nynaeve hidden, it doesn't really work for me. But, there we go. We do get a couple of sort of hints about some politics here. We do get a few gasps at this idea that Maureen and Alanna, blues and greens, actually come to support Liandrin's actions. That seems to be controversial. Blues and greens typically, apparently, not getting on with the reds. But also interesting that we get a bit of a reaction when Liandrin casually drops into the conversation that the Amyrlin was previously a blue and that she might be showing favour to Maureen. And this does seem to be a controversial thing, and there are again gasps around the hall when she says this. While Legane is punished, essentially, they do hold off on punishing Maureen. It is clear that the Amyrlin is angry with her. They make a big deal of that, but that they're not going to give her sentence just yet. So we get to follow Maureen for the rest of the episode as she tries to put things into place going forwards before this punishment drops on her. Although, as we see later in the episode, well, we'll get to that. This is very much Maureen's episode. Really cool to have an episode which is so tightly focused on one character's point of view. Apart from that opening flashback, essentially Maureen is in every scene, more or less. So we do get some really great opportunity to see Rosamund Pike killing it as Maureen Damodred, as Moiraine Sedai. The first thing we see is that she finds relatively easily where Rand and Mat are. She goes to visit Rand and Mat. She must have heard some rumours about Mat being in trouble, because she comes in here ready to do something to heal Mat. And we do get this scene where basically she's able to point out that Mat took this dagger, being an idiot in doing so, and she seems to be able to remove whatever corruption the dagger has put on him, whatever influence the dagger has put on him. I have things to say about this in the spoiler talk, but for the moment, that's what it appears to have happened. After this, we do get sort of Rand coming to be a little bit more to terms with Moiraine, and kind of he thanks her for helping Mat and kind of apologises for assuming that the very worst will happen. Although I think he's still right to be a little bit dubious of Moiraine going forwards. We also get, I think, possibly one of the sickest burns ever, as Moiraine speaks to Nynaeve and says, if you want to call yourself a wisdom, you might want to show some. Because she didn't come and get Moiraine when she realised quite how sick Mat was. And I think that was a really good line, very well delivered, and put Nynaeve very much in her place. We then have a scene which we have Moiraine meeting with presumably the leader of the Blues in a bathhouse, where they talk about how it's time for Moiraine to stay in the tower for a bit. And this is obviously a worry for Moiraine, because she needs to be out there doing her thing. I've seen a few people react negatively to this idea of having an important scene like this take place in a bathhouse. I have to say, having spent now a few years living in Finland and knowing what a culture there is around saunas in Finland, this idea that people would be having important conversations in a steam bath, basically, perhaps 5 or 6 years ago I might have been a bit kind of weird about it, but actually it makes sense to me. This is another place to get stuff done, another place where potentially they can speak in private, away from people that don't want to be able to hear them. So, yeah, actually, I have no particular problem with this scene taking place where it does. One of Moiraine's eyes and ears drops a flower or something on one of the towels to indicate that she has information for Moiraine, and Moiraine follows that into our next scene, where we discover that Egwene and Perrin are now in Tar Velon, and that Maureen is going to get a yellow to come and heal Perrin, at least of his physical injuries. There are clearly more problems going on with Perrin right now. He doesn't get much of an episode. This episode, we see a few scenes of him here and one later on at the Waygate, but nothing much more from him this week. We do, however, have Egwene blurting out that Perrin's eyes went golden during their escape from the White Cloaks, and Maureen certainly seems to show some indication that she knows what that's about, and that she's very keen that Egwene not share this information any further around. Later that evening, Maureen uses some power thing to travel to Swan, and this is where we get the reveal that this whole argument between the two of them was complete fabrication. It was an act by the two of them. And we also get to see what their relationship truly is. And it's great. I love it. The fact that Maureen and Swan are together, I think that's a really nice addition to the story. This is not a book spoiler really, but their relationship is a little bit more vagued up in the books. There are certainly hints that in the past, at least, their relationship might well have been a physical one, but we don't see any of that within the period of the books, basically. I have something I want to talk about in the spoiler section about the way that Maureen gets here and exactly where this place is. I have thoughts. We get a little more politicking from the White Tower. We get a little bit more back and forth between Maureen and Liandrin. And again, we have another killer line from Maureen in this episode. She took down Nynaeve earlier, and now she's taken down Liandrin, saying that she knows that Liandrin goes to meet a man in town, and how would her Red Sisters feel about that? And Liandrin is completely flummoxed by this, and Maureen storms off. None of this politicking saves her from her exile. It's the thing that she knows Swan has to do so that Maureen is free to leave the tower and continue her battle against the Dark One, particularly now that Swan has dropped this information that she's been having dreams that the Dark One is weak at the Eye of the World. And so Maureen needs to take the dragon to face him there. Which leads us to the finale of this particular episode, where they take the group, including Loyal, through the Waygate near Tar Velon to head north towards the Eye of the World. And then this sort of cliffhanger at the end where Matt stays behind and everyone is shouting, Matt, the gateway is closing, but Matt remains. And that is quite interesting for all sorts of reasons. I liked this episode a lot more than episode 5. As I talked about last time, episode 5 had some good moments in it, but generally I felt it was more of kind of functional, moving people around kind of episode. This episode, we got some real strong insight to some of our main characters. We got some real progress with some healing for Matt, and heading north towards the Eye of the World. And we are going to have at least some Eye of the World in our season 1. I wasn't sure for a while there, because we didn't get any drops about the Eye of the World in the places we got them in the books, but we did eventually get it from Swan. So good to see that there. And I like the fact that Maureen and Swan's relationship is closer here than it was in the books. I think that is a positive thing, and I really enjoyed it. So this is a strong episode for me. Not my favourite, that still remains episode 4, but this is a strong episode which sets up an interesting end to the season. So that's it from me, spoiler free. I'm going to talk about some of the images we've just looked through here in much more book spoiler terms. So if you want to hang around for that, if you don't mind being spoiled, but I am going to talk about some big stuff. So if you haven't read the books, I recommend ending now. Almost forgot, very, very quick plug for my own stuff. Sorry about this, but check out my podcast, storycastrob.co.uk, or find Storycastrob on iTunes or Spotify. If you want to hear me read a short story called A Very Death Ray Christmas. It's a monologue from an elderly retired supervillain going through a troublesome Christmas period. I'm very proud of the story. I'm very proud of my reading. If you want to hear more from me, go check that out. Storycast Rob on iTunes or Spotify, or visit my webpage, storycastrob.co.uk. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time. Cheers. Yeah. But if you are staying around, let's talk about some stuff. Firstly, of course, the reason that Matt is staying behind here is real world stuff. This is the point, so I understand anyway, that Barney Harris left the show. So they have to sort of leave Matt behind. They can't include him in the finale. And on one level, this sets up some really difficult stuff for how they're going to handle Matt. But it doesn't hugely affect the end of season 1, I don't think. Because Matt does nothing. At the end of book 1, once they get to Faldara and the Eye of the World, we got a few snarky lines from him, but in terms of actual contributions plot-wise, Matt doesn't really do very much. We at least got to see enough of Barney in a sort of healed sense that at least we got to see that Maureen's healing took, at least to an extent. Interesting that the healing does seem to be, at this stage, suggested as to be complete. I think that's not going to be the case going forwards. It does cause some problems at the start of book 2, and presumably season 2, as what happens at the start of book 2 drives a lot of why Matt and Rand and Perrin do what they do at the start of book 2. More on that later. So that I think is going to cause a few problems going forwards. But right in the immediate future, I think the ending of this season can be achieved without Matt around, despite the fact that I love Matt and I've loved the way that Barney Harris has been playing him. This isn't an original thought by me. I got this completely from Daniel Green's video again. But it is worth noting. I think this is true. The fact that Leandrin might have a fella in town, I was going to say boyfriend, but that really didn't seem to work in my mouth, that she might have a fella in town, I think that Maureen may have made a huge tactical error here, because I don't think Leandrin is... I don't think she's being shown here quite as anti-man as some of the Red Sisters, but I still think it's unlikely that she has a fancy man in town. And I think this might be our first hint towards Leandrin having different influences, let's say. I want to talk about this. I want to talk about this scene in particular. We have a couple of things about this scene that I want to talk about. This idea that there is a prophecy, and one version of the prophecy suggests the dragon has many heads. I honestly don't think the show's going this way. I think the show is going to stick with Rand being the dragon. I did tell you there's going to be big spoilers. I hope that I don't. So I think that's still going to be true, but at least it gives us an excuse to take everybody north with us to the Eye of the World. It does make a little bit more difficult that Matt stayed behind, because if Matt is the dragon, or even one of the heads of the dragon, they are now going without the full hands to the Eye of the World, and that should have required more of a reaction from Maureen than we got. But maybe we will see that. Maybe we'll address that in the next episode. I think it's also interesting that it kind of does set up this idea that the reason they've been saying all this time that the dragon could have been reborn as a woman might simply be because what they say about prophecies here, they get translated and reinterpreted so many times that, it is actually true that Rand is the dragon, is always going to be the dragon, and he can only be a male, but their version of the prophecies are a bit vaguer on that point. But the thing I want to address here is, what is this room and where is this room? Because this could be just the private chambers of the Amelin that have been redecorated to her tastes to make it feel like the place that she grew up. That is certainly one interpretation, and I don't think there's any necessarily indication to say that isn't what's happening here. But it does seem to me that there is another possibility. I think this may be setting up a first view of Aes Sedai using Teleran Riad, the land of... Well, another word that I've never had to say out loud in anger. So I apologise for really going at that full bore. Teleran Riad. There we go. I think this scene might actually be taking place in the world of dreams, and it may be that Swan has access to a terangrial which lets her get to it, and that terangrial we saw Maureen using in her room is not some way of creating a gateway to Swan's room, but actually is a gateway to Teleran Riad. And I do wonder if what we're seeing here is our second glimpse of someone with a one power being able to access the land of dreams. I say second because we saw Egwene shouting Rand in one of Rand's dreams a few episodes ago. And if you've read the books, you know what that signifies. So very interesting seeing that one. Very interesting possibility that they may be setting that up. Not a great deal to add here particularly, except that Maureen's clearly heard about what the significance of the yellow eyes means, and that may be worrying her. I do wonder if she might be setting up here to be a lot clearer on who the dragon is. I think maybe Maureen, despite her protestations to Swan, might be in the process of realising who the dragon is, because I think she's going to start to clock the idea that there are influences here, but not all of these influences seem to be coming from the dragon or the one power. So I talked a little bit about this and the healing of Mat. The fact that what Maureen's able to do in Eye of the World is to reduce the influence, but means that Mat has to keep carrying the dagger with him. She seems to have, in this case, fully healed him, but this idea that maybe if he comes in contact with the dagger again, it will all come flooding back. My theory for this, so this is spoilers not just for book 1, but the start of book 2 that I'm about to talk about here. So if you've not read book 2 yet, be conscious of that. But obviously in the start of book 2, Perrin Fane has followed people through the ways, grabs the dagger, and flees south from Faldara, and that results in Rand, Mat and Perrin having to follow Perrin Fane because he has Mat's dagger and Mat can't be fully healed without it. If this means we don't get Perrin Fane following through the ways, we may actually not have him at Faldara, because now it could mean Mat and Perrin meet in Tar Velon. There's some back and forth about the dagger there. Mat gets reinfected, or in fact the healing hasn't properly taken, and maybe Perrin takes the dagger there and runs away with it. It doesn't work quite as well because there's a whole Horn of Valyr in there as well. But maybe that's what they're going to do here. Maybe they're going to get back to the White Tower to discover that Perrin has gone. Mat is in a bad way again, and maybe then they have to travel south. southeast-ish, really. Maybe. Maybe that's what sets up the journey to Almuth Plain. Who knows? But that's certainly one way you could deal with the fact that that weird stuff has gone on here. So there is the interesting point here, of course, as I mentioned, that Liandrin makes a big deal about Swan coming from the Blues, and this is setting up the politics of the White Tower in that regard. I've had a friend ask me whether I think that Liandrin is going to take the place of Eleda, or that the two are going to be combined into one character. I had assumed not. I had been fairly confident that the two were going to continue to be separate characters because they have very different paths in the book. I am beginning to wonder now whether maybe actually that's not going to be the case. Whether actually we are going to see... Oh, but I do want to see Liandrin's storyline follow this plot it was, and I do want to see Eleda's story follow the plot it was, and I don't think the two can really intersect for many more seasons. So, yeah, I still think there are going to be two characters. I hope there are going to be two characters. I have nothing really extra to say about the flashback here. Again, we talked about how Tyr is so vehemently against channelers. I think we see a glimpse of the Stone of Tyr in the background. That sets up some stuff for the Dragon Reborn, or season 3, season 2's got to be mostly book 2, right? So much happens in book 2. I think it's going to have to be. So that's it from me. That's all I wanted to say about this episode. Thank you very much for sticking with me. I hope you enjoyed that. I'm very much loving this show. I've got some problems with it still. There are still some things which don't really work for me. But on the whole, I am loving this adaptation of The Wheel of Time. And I am gutted we only have 2 more episodes and then the long wait begins again. But I'll be back next week with further thoughts about The Wheel of Time. So I will catch you next time. Cheers.